Well, we've finally reached that point when the current administration has decided to declare all out war on every cryptocurrency except Bitcoin. This has been a long time coming, and it was heavily foreshadowed. They tried to play favorites with their second biggest donor. He turned out to be a PR Satan, and now they're in cleanup mode. The only way they can compensate for their close ties to SBF is by crafting a track record of being the tough cops on the crypto beat. That means that Gary Gensler got his wishes granted by the White House genies, and he was greenlighted to declare war on over 99% of crypto. Unfortunately, that's where we are. Now the name of the game is probably just survival. Ready? Let's go. Today, we are going to cover the declaration of war in NYMag from your boy, Uncle Gary Gensler, the relationship or lack thereof of his view to decentralization, all the encouraging news from the February Cardano 360, and a very welcome leak from Charles. If you can't tell if Uncle Gary is just very fond of chiclets or if those are AI double teeth, or if you're finding value in these videos each weekday, please consider delegating to the Army of Spies stake pool, ticker AOS. Well, here it is, guys. NYMag.com. This is the big declaration of war. He's been warming up for this for a long time. He's been talking all about how various things in crypto were obviously securities from his viewpoint. Remember, he's not an attorney. But in his legal opinion as a non-attorney, everything in crypto was a security. He's been saying that for a while. Kind of, he's more so these little piecemeal statements. Stable coins, obviously securities. Synthetics, obviously securities. He's just been kind of like biting off little chunks. Once or twice, he said pretty much everything was a security, but he didn't throw that down every single time. It was more like these little bites. This was the one where he just swallowed all of crypto. He just declared all of crypto except for Bitcoin securities. They're all securities in the view of Gary Gensler. And it's not hard to guess his motivation. So it seems to be very well known and discussed that Gary Gensler one day wants to be the Secretary of the Treasury. And there is also talk that Janet Yellen may leave that post. If Biden is reelected, Janet Yellen may leave that post. And so Gary Gensler, this is not a long-term view for him. This is not something he's hoping is going to happen in like a decade. He's hoping this is going to happen in just a short amount of time. The election, of course, will be a year from November. So that would be the changeover where, as the story goes, Janet Yellen might be stepping away from Treasury, and Gary Gensler, his desire apparently is just to step right in those shoes and be Secretary of Treasury. So there's a problem. The party of the current administration got real cozy with SBF. SBF was meeting with all kinds of policymakers, people in Congress, people who worked for the White House, even Mr. Gary Gensler. He too met with SBF, I believe, multiple times. I believe we've seen multiple times on his calendar where he met with SBF. And of course, this is something they have to recover from. They can't just say, oh yeah, our second biggest donor and a guy we were letting pretty much everybody meet with turned out to be the biggest villain in crypto. I think it's fair to say that without alleging any kind of criminal wrongdoing or anything like that, we could say that certainly from the PR perspective, SBF is the biggest villain in crypto ever, maybe. I mean, after the Mt. Gox crash and that whole fiasco, it seemed like Mark Karpelès would probably be, regarded by many as the biggest villain in crypto because it was very unclear who did what was his fault, what wasn't. But I think we can now say that, at least from a PR perspective, SBF is the biggest villain we've ever had in crypto. I mean, we've probably had worse characters in crypto, but nobody has gotten this much exposure for alleged villainous activities as SBF, and problematically, second biggest donor for the current administration's party, and also meeting with all kinds of people, including Gary Gensler. They've got to clean this up somehow. The only way they can clean this up is because this is going to come up in the next presidential election cycle. This is going to come up over and over again. This is going to be a talking point for, the other party. The only way to compensate for this, black eye, for us in crypto, this is like a big deal. For, in the grand scheme of politics, this is just one topic among many, but they have to make some kind of attempt to clean this up. And the only way they can compensate for this is if they can turn around and say, hey, yeah, maybe that happened. He turned out to be a bad guy, and they won't be able to deny that all these meetings happened and he had all this access, but they can turn around and say, hey, we have been so tough on crypto. Look at what we've done with crypto since then. We have completely cleaned up crypto. I'm not saying that's what will actually happen. I'm saying that's how they'll paint it. And when they say clean up crypto, what they mean is crush crypto, completely oppress crypto. And that's pretty much what this article is all about, sort of signaling the message. They're setting the initial messaging about crypto for the constituents of their party in this article. So if we scroll down here, it's buried. They go through a lot of other stuff. It's kind of buried clear down here. But we get down to this section, and there are some very choice quotes, which everybody in the crypto social media tweet sphere has noticed since this article came out. Everything other than Bitcoin, Gensler told the reporter here. You can find a website. You can find a group of entrepreneurs. They might set up their legal entities in a tax haven offshore. They might have a foundation. They might lawyer it up to try to arbitrage and make it hard jurisdictionally or so forth. In other words, there are people behind these cryptocurrencies using a variety of complex and legally opaque mechanisms. But at the most basic level, they're trying to promote their token and entice investors. Bitcoin, because of its unique history and creation story, is fundamentally different from other crypto projects in this respect. And here we have the part of the quote that might be the most thought about by Cardano people, I think, in the future. They might drop their tokens overseas at first and contend or pretend that it's going to take 6 months before they come back to the US, he continued. But at the core, he argued, these tokens are securities because there's a group in the middle and the public is anticipating profits based on that group. The claim that crypto investors are hoping to profit based on the efforts of those intermediaries, in much the same way that stockholders in public companies hope to see their investments appreciate over time, is central to Gensler's position that as a legal matter, these are actually transactions and securities that fall within the SEC's jurisdictions. So you can see he straight up says everything other than Bitcoin. And he is not making any room for ICOs that happened overseas. He's saying, hey, you might have had an ICO overseas, but we're thinking about the secondary market when the buyers in that ICO come and sell their tokens in the US. Or, I mean, it's all happening in the digital sphere. So they're selling them on some exchange that US buyers have access to. US buyers are on the receiving end. So he's saying those tokens are coming back to the US regardless of what the projects contend or pretend. So this is all pretty problematic for crypto. So this isn't something that just the base layer currency issuers need to worry about. This isn't the kind of thing that just like the Ethereum Foundation needs to worry about. This is pretty much everybody in crypto. Pay attention to this part. Over the course of our discussion, he articulated a straightforward view of the agency's reach, that pretty much every sort of crypto transaction already falls under the SEC's jurisdiction, except spot transactions in Bitcoin itself and the actual purchase or sell of goods or services with cryptocurrencies. He's saying every other type of crypto transaction is going to fall under the SEC's jurisdiction, except trading Bitcoin and just straight trading of Bitcoin. And if you're buying a good or service with crypto. That's it. That's all he's making room for. That is the entirety of it. This is despite past declarations from members of the SEC who specifically famously cited in the XRP case said that Ethereum was not a security. This SEC doesn't care about that. Commissioner Gensler doesn't care about that. And you notice he also doesn't really care about decentralization. His test isn't even the Howey test. He says, here's his test. These tokens are securities because there's a group in the middle and the public is anticipating profits based on that group. That's pretty much it. He says, if you can find a website, you can find a group of entrepreneurs. Doesn't matter what they do. If there's a group of people in the middle, if they have a website basically, and there's a group of people in the middle, he's going to call it a security because let's face it, anytime the public is buying crypto, with very few corner case exceptions, maybe pretty much, I mean, we could imagine some weird, charity type things where someone is buying something, knowing that it'll never accrue, appreciate in value. Maybe there's some corner cases out there that maybe are an exception to this, but the vast majority of the time, if somebody's buying crypto, they're buying it because they're hoping they're going to make some profits. And he is correct that the vast majority of projects since Bitcoin have had founders, they've had foundations, teams, developers behind them who weren't these anonymous, pseudonymous individuals who never sold their holdings. I mean, the things that Satoshi has going for him are exactly the things that nobody did after him, or at least very few people. Satoshi was completely anonymous. And he never sold his Bitcoin. He, she, they, whatever Satoshi was, they never sold their Bitcoin. It's easy for Gensler to make that distinction because there's no way for him to go after Satoshi. There is literally no one to identify in Bitcoin that he can go after, unless he comes with some weird legal theory about the miners. Very difficult to identify any person in Bitcoin to go after. Everybody else, he can identify somebody. So because that's the only distinguishing feature between the one case where he really, as a practical matter, can't go after anybody, of course, he makes that the dividing line. He says, are there people? Then it's a security. That's pretty much it. Can you identify people involved in the project? Then it's a security. And I think there could be an additional caveat to that. If you had a project where the founders built the project and literally didn't take any coins, literally didn't make any money whatsoever, maybe that would be a different carve out in his viewpoint. But you can see his viewpoint, his dividing line between what is outside the SEC's jurisdiction, like basically what's a security and what's not. So what about Cardano? Well, obviously this sentence right here is interesting for Cardano. They might drop their tokens overseas at first and contend or pretend that it's going to take 6 months before they come back to the US. But at the core, these tokens are securities because there's a group in the middle and the public is anticipating profits. So this is sort of an interesting jurisdictional question for the SEC. So in the case of Cardano, you've got this ICO that happened in Japan. And the Cardano Foundation has very good numbers. They have very good data on the buyers in that ICO. It wasn't one of these fake overseas ICOs where they sell and they're like, hey, no US IPs allowed for this ICO. And then everybody just VPNs. It wasn't one of those. They've actually got very good numbers. They've got very good breakdowns that I believe used to be on the Cardano Foundation website. I think they probably still are somewhere. They got very good numbers about all of the buyers, and all of the buyers appear to be citizens of various Asian nations, mainly Japan, and then there's a few others. But there are no US buyers in those stats that I've been able to identify. It's all Asian Asian nation state citizens in among the buyers. But Gary Gensler, of course, he knows this. I mean, Cardano is a top 10 cryptocurrency. If you think that the SEC hasn't gone through and looked at every single probably top 30, top 50 cryptocurrency and tried to construct a case as to why they're securities, you're crazy. They have. I'm sure they have. And especially the top 10 cryptocurrencies, they've gone through and looked at all of them. Pretty easy in the case of Ethereum, that was just a straight up ICO. Then you've got Cardano with this Japanese ICO. Who would Gary Gensler be talking about if not Cardano? And this is certainly interesting. This is gonna pique our interest in Cardano, what he's saying right here. But whether or not a court agrees with him, if you do this ICO in Asia with all Asian buyers, and just due to the nature of digital assets, eventually some of those assets, seep into the US through secondary markets. Who's responsible for that? Who's responsible for that secondary transaction in those securities to US buyers? Is it IOG? Let's go through this wild scenario. Let's say they say, hey, IOG, you obviously knew this would happen. So you're not off the hook for a securities offering to US buyers when you knew that the secondary market would get there. And I'm not saying there is good precedent for this kind of a decision, but let's just say we have this wild decision where a court says, yep, IOG knew that eventually those would get into the hands of US citizens in the secondary market. And then, IOG or people related to IOG would also sell into those same secondary markets. If they came, not saying those are the facts, but if those were the facts, hypothetically, and a court came to that decision, what exactly would happen? What would happen to the Cardano project? Well, lucky for us, a lot of people on Twitter are talking about this kind of thing, not in the context of Cardano necessarily, but in the context of all crypto projects. So first off, people are really confused by this declaration of war by Gensler because they like to point out that, hey, Bitcoin is the one that's off the hook here. Bitcoin only has 5 people who have commit access to the GitHub repository. Here's the post from earlier this month, February 16th, where they said, Vladimir Vanderland's access to Bitcoin Core's GitHub repository was finally taken away on Thursday at his own request. Bitcoin Core has 5 maintainers now after a sixth long-serving maintainer stepped down Thursday morning. In the past 18 months, 4 Bitcoin Core maintainers have stepped aside or turned over, citing burnout or legal risk. So yes, that is the case, apparently. Only 5 people actually have access to the Bitcoin Core code. This is very confusing for crypto people because they're like, hey, Bitcoin is like the least decentralized. It's the least decentralized. Like 5 people control the code, and only a very small handful of large mining pools control the validation. It's the least decentralized. How come it gets off the hook? It's because Gary Gensler doesn't care about decentralization. I've said this a million times. He does not care about decentralization. That's not a part of his definition of a security. So here's a pretty fair rundown of what's happened to projects the SEC has actually gone after. You get a fine plus the requirement that you register those crypto assets as a security. You get a fine and an order to destroy all pre-mined tokens and delist tokens from all exchanges. And I think this is also pretty accurate. The result of either of those two is that the tokens go to zero because there is no way to register. No one has been able to register. So because you can't register, the assertion here is token value goes to zero. And if you're ordered to destroy all the pre-mined tokens and delist them from all exchanges, the assertion is the tokens also go to zero. The only third alternative we've seen has been in this kick case where they just got a fine, but they were not required to destroy the tokens or delist them. But this has been the only case where this has happened. This hasn't happened in any other cases that I know of, at least. So everybody's sort of banking on one of these two for the projects that the SEC goes after. So the next question you have to ask is, who are they going to go after? So here's where we get into some weird territory, because Gary Gensler is saying they're all securities, but we know only so many people work at the SEC, and they're probably not going to be able to go after everybody. Would this have a chilling effect on people deciding to start crypto projects or not and having anything to do with the US? Yeah, certainly. Definitely. Just that article will have a chilling effect on how many crypto projects get started. But among the projects that have long ago been founded and gotten their tokens out into the wild, what happens to those projects? Well, it's kind of dependent on how many projects and who the SEC decides to go after. And I have a feeling we won't really know the answer to that question until the SEC goes after those projects. Here's a great thing for Cardano, which may or may not be meaningful. I mean, Gary Gensler is a wild dude. He's a wild dude. He just came out guns blazing and said everything in this gigantic industry is illegal. So you can see here from this breakdown, CoinGecko puts the total crypto market cap at 1.13 trillion, consisting of 12,306 tokens. BTC is 40% of that. So we're talking about $663 billion in value that are illegal, according to Gary Gensler. And elsewhere in this thread, the same poster points out that the number of tokens he thinks are illegal are actually greater than the total number of companies that are registered with the SEC. So he's saying 663 billion. So we're talking about most of $1 trillion in value is illegal here. This is a gigantic amount of value. Are they just going to wipe this off the boards? Something tells me, I mean, Gary Gensler is a wild dude, but something tells me that's too much money. If this current administration destroys that much in value, if they put down this entire industry, something tells me that's too big a hit. So I'm thinking they just go for some headline making victories. They want to make some big headlines, create some clout for themselves as the tough crypto cop on the beat so they can use that in the next election cycle. I don't think they want to destroy this much in value. Chilling effect, yes, they're probably totally okay with that. But if they blatantly destroy 663 billion in value, that might be a problem for them in the next election cycle. So I think they go after the low-hanging fruit. Cardano, because they would have to make this secondary market argument. They can't say, hey, you did an ICO in the US. That's pretty simple. With Ethereum and some other cryptocurrencies like EOS, which they already went after and got that giant settlement. With some blockchains like that, it's pretty easy because they actually did their ICOs in the US. I think they go after the low-hanging fruit. If they're going after base layer cryptocurrency issuances, they're going after those ICOs. I don't think they go after the secondary market argument first. So I think Cardano, having done their ICO overseas, much better position than a lot of things in the EVM world where they just went ICO crazy, just sold to US investors like crazy in the primary ICO. The SEC is going to go out. Those are much lower hanging fruits for the SEC than the Cardano, where you have to make this secondary market argument. So I think that's good for Cardano. But like I said, Gary Gensler is a wild dude. We don't know what he's going to do. I have a strange feeling he's just going to go for whatever will be the biggest headlines for him, because his dream is to be the Secretary of the Treasury. That's his dream. So he wants those big headlines. So I think he goes after the lowest hanging fruit. He doesn't want to lose cases. He doesn't want to try to take down a top 10 crypto blockchain and lose the case. He wants to go after the big headlines, and he wants to be low hanging fruit so that there's less of a chance that he loses a big case like that. But not everything is potential doom and gloom. We also just had Cardano 360, now called Essential Cardano 360, and it was a full Triple H, Harrison, Hammond, Hemsley. Kevin Hammond told us about the very smooth Valentine upgrade, adding easier development of interoperability in Cardano dApps by adding 2 SECP elliptic curves to enable ECDSA and Schnorr signatures. Cardano natively uses EDDSA, E DSA, which is Edwards curve digital signature algorithm. SECP is used by blockchains like Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Binance. We also found out that Nigel Hemsley is now the VP of Voltaire for IOG. He said there are three pillars to Voltaire: the members based organization, people refer to that as the MBO, the Constitution, and democratic consent. The spots where you can participate right now as we sort of ramp up to SIP 1694 and Voltaire are the SIP 1694 GitHub, the Foundation's governance forum, and the MBO website. And links for all three of those spots, I believe, maybe with the exception of the GitHub for SIP 1694, which you can find just by Googling, are in this video, not this video where I'm speaking right now, but in the Cardano 360 video. So go over to their video and you can find those links. In a sense, this was actually a quadruple H because we also heard from Harrison Warren, who's the product lead for Catalyst. He said soon there will be a special voting event. They're going to call these special voting events SVEs. This SVE will be announced in the coming weeks. And he also mentioned soon they'll also launch DREPs. I think this is quite a transformation for the Cardano community. We're going to become something that not a lot of blockchains can possibly claim to be. When we have actual on-chain governance in place, and if it's anything as complicated as SIP 1694, we're going to be in a very different place from almost every other blockchain. It's going to be quite a different thing. Cardano will be very distinguishable from almost any other blockchain. We also got some news from Alex Appledorn, who's the head of product for Lace. He let us know that Lace is going to mainnet in the coming weeks. So no surprise here, Lace and Voltaire are kind of coinciding. I think IOG is probably expecting that a certain amount of the community at least is going to want to use Lace for Voltaire purposes. Finally, you may or may not have noticed in the latest AMA from Charles, he leaked that Marlowe is coming to Mainnet next month. So it sounds like we will have Marlowe on Mainnet in March. I'm personally very excited about this. When the original Army of Spies project, which came before this channel was sort of an outgrowth of that original project. When we put that project in Catalyst Fund 3, if I remember correctly, the code that I wrote and included in the proposal for that project was actually in Marlowe, a much earlier version of Marlowe than we've got now. But the ease with which you could imagine constructing a smart contract as a non-Haskell developer, as a non-developer even, because it's a very, very low code solution. I would say almost no code. It can produce a certain type of very readable Marlowe code for you, but you can basically put it together, at least in those days, with Blockly, which is a completely graphical, no code kind of construction interface. But I've always been very, very interested in where Marlowe goes. So I'm excited to see it go to mainnet, and I'm excited to see what people can do with it, because it was always sort of posed as this like system for financial smart contracts only. But man, this is Cardano. We're pretty creative. I can imagine people building, if Marlowe works the way we always wanted it to, I can imagine people building all kinds of things. I mean, you could argue everything in crypto is financial, but I mean, I can imagine people building all kinds of things. I hope you had a great weekend. I hope you're looking forward to a great week, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.